Did y'all get kicked off briefly as well? Nice.
Did I break something? Hey, y'all.
Oh, David hopped off and so did everyone else,
Oh,
by
we
way of
did leave meeting.
that.
Yeah, end meeting for all. Whoopsies. Yeah, you gotta assign host. Good thing I'm back. But also, if I do that, I think the same thing might happen. So noted.
Yeah, please stay with us or give away your power.
Actually, let's just go ahead and. All right, there we go. You have the power, Kate.
I just I just shared an agenda for the meeting, and this is one that I pushed up into SIG Docs, and so I think we'll get comfortable with the flow of how we choose to run the SIG as it goes on. But essentially, we'll post meeting agendas before, and anyone is welcome to put a PR in with agenda items. And since this is the first time, obviously, like feel free to speak any additional agenda items, and we can continue to do that too. And this is just some things that I thought we could cover based on the past discussions we've had, and we don't need to feel tied to this agenda of conversation naturally flows a different way as well. And I think we can wait one more minute to get started. Is anyone passionate about note taking? I
And
know we
do you
have
want
technical writers
notes?
here.
Do
I
you
can
want
be passionate
notes?
about note taking.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Are they going to be in HackMD or a Google Doc?
I think we should probably put them in um, the same file that we have the agenda there inside meetings, that repository. So Eric, if you're able to clone that, like fork and clone that, and then take notes in there, we can then put a PR in, pushing those up.
Sounds good.
Does that seem like a normal flow, Bailey, that some of the other SIGs have taken?
Uh, Most of the SIGs that I see in CNCF and here, we either have a Google Doc or a HackMD that multiple people jam on at the same time. You know, some tool that has collaborative editing, and then it's up to the chair or note taker to upload it to GitHub. But I will
Ooh.
say that the gap between that one gap of the manual step has been a problem. So I don't have a right answer here.
Yeah, I've had the experience of going to look for meeting notes from some of the other SIGs, and there isn't a trail left in the meetings repo to find it. And that could be an issue. So I think it's fine to have them someplace else, but having a link here so that you can go get them out of the this one spot um, would be a good safety net.
So I'm not sure if that is that one spot that you're referring to. Is
The
that the
in the
HackMD?
Yeah, well, no, in the meetings repo. Um, so I mean, I see in the agenda document there's a place for notes, and so either put the notes there, or if the notes are someplace else, put the link to the notes there, because otherwise it'll be hard to find them. If they're in some HackMD instance or a Google Doc someplace else, you'll never find it. And some SIGs have told me, oh, well, we accumulate information in our working docs, so you have to go read like working docs to try and figure out what's going on, which is also not great. So
Okay. Well, let's then try this strategy of, namely, there is no other doc, so you better push this up to GitHub. And if we find that it doesn't provide enough collaboration on note taking, then we can switch to like an intermediative HackMD that we can then work on during the meeting and then push up together. Does that sound reasonable to you, Eric?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Awesome. With that being said, I think we can go ahead and kick off since we're five after. So welcome everyone to the inaugural meeting of SIG Docs. And just to give some context on how this SIG came to be, in case you weren't there for its inception, many of the folks here were at the Componentize the World event last year in September. We kind of got together at a SIG Docs table, unknowingly knowing that was a SIG Docs table, and worked on namely the component model book. And through that, realized there was a lot of other initiatives we wanted to take on. And we needed some sort of structure in order to kind of keep ourselves accountable for working on documentation within the Bytecode Alliance. And so we created a SIG Docs charter, which is linked in the agenda there. But actually, I could probably share my screen too to look at it together. Great. So the charter itself defines some scope for the SIG, namely to create, maintain, and promote documentation of the Bytecode Alliance ecosystem. And so that's a broad umbrella, but you could think of it in some way to scope it down, basically maintain documentation and projects within that Bytecode Alliance GitHub organization, if that's helpful. And for some projects, it may be recommending structure or documentation rather than actually doing it, because we might not be the experts for that project. And then another sub area of it might be to create tooling to generate documentation. So there's been talk about how do we make WIT documentation more readable and accessible? Can we create a REST docs for WIT? There have been conversations around that and pushing that out. And then there are things also like within the specifications that we could work on as well, such as the @docs handles for WIT. So several things that could fall within our umbrella. And I think that's about most of it. So that's the charter, and feel free to read it more if you would like. And that's about concludes our announcement. The other thing I will say is a big important part of this inaugural meeting is to figure out who can be our co-chairs for this SIG Docs. And so at the end of the meeting, we'll take a vote on that so that we know who is kind of taking the reins here. And so if you would like to be nominated for a co-chair, please put that in Slack, in Zoom in the chat here. And so we can make sure to add you. We'll have a poll at the end. David found a really nice poll maker that we can use. And so we can take a vote at the end of the meeting when hopefully everyone's had a chance to show up. I'm self-nominating, so I'll put my name in the chat, and then ideally we hopefully have one or more the other people who are self-nominating, and ideally from two different companies, I think is the best practice. With that being said, I just want to take a moment to pause so that we can all introduce ourselves and everyone can go around and kind of say like why they're interested in SIG Docs and what brings them here and what they hope that the SIG will cover. I guess I can start. I didn't even introduce myself. I'm Kate Goldenring. I'm a software engineer at Fermyon. I got into the SIG Docs space by working on the component model book with Ivan Tellison, who also works at Fermyon. And I came at it from a perspective of wanting to learn more about the component model. And so building out the component book kind of helped me kind of really dive into it myself, and was hoping that that would be a way that others might find it to be a lower barrier of entry into the ecosystem. Hey, Merlin. We're just going around introducing ourselves and what brings us to the meeting. So I'll pass it off to, I'm going to call someone out. Sorry, Calvin, will you introduce yourself?
Of course. My name is Calvin Pruitt. I work together with Danny McCovey, who's right here on the meeting too. We work at Jaff Labs, and we're trying to build a registry for WebAssembly components. And we care very much about documentation because a lot of this stuff needs to be documented better. And we've been working on a way of rendering documentation for components, and happy to share that as well. I'll pass it to Danny real quick and then.
Cool. Yep. So like Calvin said, I'm Danny. I've been working with him and others on registry solutions for WebAssembly components. And yeah, so I've been thinking quite a bit lately about like auto rendering docs based on parsing binaries and stuff. And yeah, we're basically very interested in improving general developer experience in the WASM ecosystem, and docs is obviously a crucial part of achieving that. So nearest me on my screen is Bailey, so I'll pass it to her.
Thank you, Danny. Hey, Bailey Hayes, CTO at Cosmonic. I'm on the TSE for the Bytecode Alliance. I'm also one of the WASI co-chairs. I am here to help facilitate bootstrapping a new SIG, and I really appreciate working with David and Kate on coming up with a written process for how to bootstrap new SIGs and tools and best practices. So SIG Docs is already killing it, serving its purpose. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna jump to David Bryant.
Hello, everyone. David Bryant. I'm the consulting executive director for the Bytecode Alliance. And so part of the reason I'm here, as Bailey mentioned, is to help the bootstrapping and facilitation of the SIG, wearing that kind of day-to-day job hat. I will also say that documentation has a special place in my heart. I've always considered documentation as an equally important, equally essential part of the user experience and user interface around any product, software, hardware, or otherwise. And I think it needs that level of attention and care. I also will say that we often get requests from prospective members and new members of the Bytecode Alliance to a documentation, I don't know, trail, discovery path, something. It's like, what do we need to know? How do we get started? How do our engineers get started? Where's the right sort of frame of mind for these things? And so I think as much as people are attracted to the technology, it seems like the first thing we ever get asked about by anyone interested in being part of this effort is the documentation. So, whatever we can do to kind of recognize that and support and enable that and sort of elevate documentation to be an equal partner in terms of advancing the work that we're doing, I think is important. And so I'm here for that too. And I'll pass the introductory torch to Eric.
Howdy, everyone. I'm a technical writer at Cosmonic, and wow, the way David put that was beautiful. Really just want to create the happiest path of onboarding into the WASM ecosystem as possible, and help facilitate that in whatever way I can. And I will pass to Thorsten.
Yeah, hi, Thorsten Hans, my name. As Kate already mentioned, I'm working at Fermion as cloud advocate, and as part of my role, I try to engage developers adopting WebAssembly, and so to speak, the WebAssembly component model. And as part of the user journey, I think it's valuable to have great documentation in place, and I'm here to try to spot maybe a place where I can help building great documentation for other developers to discover all the things WebAssembly. And yeah, with that, I pass over to Sohan.
Thanks, Thorsten. Hi, I'm Sohan. I'm based in the Netherlands. Also work at Fermion in the DevRel team. This is my first time doing one of these. I was speaking to Kate when we met in person about a month ago, and she mentioned that there is this thing happening for the docs, and I thought I could also help because I think documentation is super important for the dev experience. So that's why I'm here. Haven't done like a special interest group thing before, so quite excited to see how that goes. And I'm passing that off to Madeleine.
Hey everyone, I'm a teacher at Ghent University in Belgium, and I'm a researcher at IMEC, also in Belgium. And we have a couple of master's students and in the future PhD students who will be working on WebAssembly for embedded Linux devices and probably also microcontrollers. And the reason why I became interested in documentation for this is because last year we had our first master's student working on WebAssembly system interface, and he was having a really difficult time because of the lack of documentation. And so this year with the new documentation website for the component model, I see that a lot of students are actually using that now as a good introduction. And so I would like to improve the situation even more so it's easier to onboard new students, onboard new people. And I think because I'm always interacting with students who have their first experience with WebAssembly, I think I'm one of the people that should be doing this.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for introducing yourself. And I think from that context, we got some highlights of what people have already found interesting and helpful in the documentation so far. One thing I wanted to do was review some of the previous discussions we've had on documentation to kind of level set some of the areas people have mentioned being interested in. And then we can go through some other agenda items if people have any. So if you have something that's you want to talk about in this meeting, feel free to drop it into the chat. I know we have WASM.io and KubeCon coming up, and there might be it might be a good opportunity to push towards making some documentation more stable, and a great thing we're proud to point people to, namely Component Book could use a full new iteration on its examples, etc. So that kind of covers the first bullet point of something we talked about. And the location that some of this conversation happened at was at the Plumbers Summit. And we had a docs breakout where we talked, kind of sticky noted it on Bailey's amazing Miro board, some of the things that we wanted to think about with SIG Docs. And a big one was, hey, we have this big event coming up, which is actually very soon now. And that is WASM.io and KubeCon. People are going to ask about this component model. They're going to ask about WASI. Where do we point them? And so as a discussion around that, do people have, besides the component model book, what are some other areas that people think as a SIG we could help prepare for that event?
I think examples would be really key. And one thing I've noticed is that we haven't done the work of doing a user journey exercise of, hey, I'm a complete newbie. I know nothing. And somebody just gave me a component and they said, embed it with your own component. What do I do? If we use that as a user journey and walk through and said, okay, let's start with Coco component because we know that's the best experience we have right now. I think we'd learn a lot and we'd fix a lot of things. For example, I think we got reported earlier this week that the example didn't work. So there's stuff like that we should probably button up that is a user experience thing, but also trying to write up the documentation that takes people through the right journeys.
And just to clarify, for the user journey you're thinking of, does that just mean any example that works, or are you thinking like pivoting on the example that's there now, like creating multiple user journeys or different ones than we currently have?
I think we should probably think of a set of them, but probably keep it 5 or less. And target it for the, what we think are going to be the most popular, most likely journeys that people are going to go through. And then we can expand out the user stories from there. But it's pretty easy for me to think of a few off the top of my head, right? I want to build a CLI. That's story 1. I want to build an HTTP app, like a service, story 2. Somebody gives me a component, I want to figure out how to use it in my own component, story 3. I'm sure other folks can come up with a few others from there, but I think there's a lot there. And then, kind of on that note is, I'll go back to my first one that I gave, which is somebody gave me a component, what do? Components can be self-describing and they can have doc tags inside them. And then another note is, using WASI and what the pieces and parts of WASI are is kind of confusing right now. And we do have doc in the WIT definition. So maybe finding easier ways to surface that so that while users are working through, they can understand it. I think just starting with that one, there's a lot there. More doc than probably some of the others that I mentioned, just because I know the component model book does a good job of explaining those. So I think the embedded is kind of a hard one right now. Marilyn?
So I was wondering, is it maybe interesting to move all the documentation into the component model book and see that as the generic WebAssembly system interface documentation place?
I will speak with Ivan's voice echoing in the back of my head. He was very passionate about keeping the component book separate from a WASI book, because I think there is already some confusion about what the overlap there is and isn't. And maybe you could argue that putting them together is a great opportunity to distinguish them like in one place and say this is how they're distinct technologies. So, but we have talked about within, but having a separate WASI book and potentially maintaining that in the same repository would be one way of doing it. So the repository could be renamed docs, and within it, we even have a component book already in its subfolder. So we could have a separate WASI book in a separate subfolder. And that also points out we have wazi.dev as a site, and having some documentation that it could point to would be very helpful. But also within WASI, like when you imagine documenting WASI, what is it that you imagine? Do you imagine documenting what is WASI 2.0? Like these are the interfaces that are 2.0, and talking about how you would use each interface. Is that kind of what you imagine?
So part of it is that what it is exactly. I think what people can expect from it in terms of backwards compatibility and stuff like that. That's also right now. I think we are in need of simply sort of reference documentation that isn't written as a standard. And what would also be interesting is, for example, how do you actually build new system interfaces and stuff like that? Not necessarily in order to add them into WASI, but simply how to use the WIT language and how to build what are they called, like the host side of system interfaces in certain runtimes. I think that's interesting documentation to have. I'm not sure if a WASI documentation website is the right place for that.
I personally agree. That's all very useful. Danny, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just I think specifically like with WASI, it becomes interesting to think about kind of this like auto docking kind of thing. Because I think like right now the main kind of various WASI packages, they are version bumped and they also refer directly to each other. So I kind of think that it's like already set up so that way, when there are modifications, you can do a version bump, and then that would, link to another package if like, like all of the WASI interfaces depend on WASI IO. So if you're like looking at a type that is derived from WASI IO, then you should like be informed that this type was defined over in this other package, and you should also probably be linked to a page of the version that it's like currently using. So I think that there's probably an opportunity here to like have a kind of a like docs.rs experience for WASI. And then also with some of the other stuff that was being said too, if you have things that are implementing these interfaces, it would also be nice to have like pages that you know mention that this is an implementation of this interface, or so on or so forth. But yeah.
Thorsten?
Yeah, I just want to take one step back because you asked the question, what are the resources that we should or users should be pointed to? And I think most people have a hard time in discovering and connecting all the different bits that are under the WebAssembly umbrella, right? How WIT relates to the component model and how this again relates to WASI. And I think having some kind of landing page that that brings together all those pieces, and what Danny mentioned is seems to me like docs RS, which points you immediately to a reference maybe of that particular WIT world that I would be interested in. So I would find it really helpful if there is like a guidance that the user can maybe at some point decide, okay, I'm tasked with using a component that a colleague of mine created. So I know I have to go somewhere in that component direction, and from there I have maybe embedding or linking components or composing a new component out of multiple components. So I think the user journey aligns from top when I enter that topic, that I can find my way through the different pillars that are out there.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point of like the different user stories people will have with documentation. Your story seemed to start as a developer. Like I have this like interface and I want to understand more about it. I think there's also the user story of I'm at Wasm.io and I just heard of this component model thing for the first time. And so I think figuring out who these user stories are and how we can get them to the documentation they need might be a helpful strategy.
Yeah, that puts it on point. I guess the when I'm looking in parallel at the component model book, right? So understanding the component model, those 8 points, that's great, right? To have a path that guides me through all the details that I need to know in order to understand what a component model is. But then using the component model, that's a language specific. Okay, we need a story for, hey, I'm a Rust developer. I want to use the component model. But then the user stories are mixed, right? Creating and consuming, authoring, composing. Maybe that's exactly, so at least from my point of view, that could be the perfect spot to bring in scenarios, right? I wanna do XYZ. Or I am that kind of person that has to deal with components. Maybe that's already a point where we can draw the bigger picture and provide those threads for different personas.
And speaking of pictures, I really, really, really like to diagram. So having a place where I can drop some of the picture version of how all this comes together would be really nice, because that's how I think in things. Danny, I see how your hand is raised. Sorry for jumping in there.
Oh, no, you're fine. But yeah, I guess a couple of things that I'm just thinking as people are saying things. I guess yeah, Kate is bringing up the good point of there being like different user stories and people like, happening upon the docs in various ways. And so it does kind of feel like, yeah, it seems like the component like model book is more for like, hey, this is how you create your own component. And right now there's not really like a centralized place where there are like, okay, here are useful components that I just want to grab and go use. Um, and I guess, well, there's a couple of things, but there is some stuff that like Calvin and I have been working on lately, and I could, if you guys want, I could share my screen and like kind of show that a little bit, because I think that it might be helpful to the conversation. But yeah,
Sure, yeah. Do you have the powers that be?
let's see.
Okay. If you don't, we'll pass them off.
Yeah, it seems like I do. Um, cool. So basically, this like URL here is like a preview, and we've been like looking at, or we're kind of like thinking about making this not a preview, but essentially like you can search over here for various things, and if like you search for any of like and so there's like I've been doing a lot of development here, so there's like a lot of like packages here that are like silly and don't do anything, but also all of the WASI interfaces are here. So like if we go to WASI CLI, we're basically like rendering out like docs automatically, and so this is also leveraging the WARG protocol. So basically, in any of like the like GitHub repos for WIT, like you can do a WIT build on those, which will produce a binary, and then you can publish those to WARG. And if you published multiple versions, you'd be able to see actually like how the interface definitions are changing from version to version on each of these. And then like kind of like what I was mentioning before, if you have something that is like it's kind of easier with WASI HTTP because HTTP uses like a lot of different WASI interfaces. But right, it's indicating that the types that are like defined in the HTTP interface are, being defined in terms of types that are defined in foreign WIT packages. So here we would be able to like link over to WASI IO. And then here we can see also like, that you can have to go and see what the interfaces were at any of the versions that were published via WARG publish. Um, so anyways, and then we also want there to be the ability to have implementations of these interfaces here as well. And you can publish those to WARG, and we are auto-generating docs there, but composition then becomes more of a thing that you have to think about, which is something that we've been thinking about. But anyways, this feels very much, or what I've been thinking of as we've been working on this is more of the like user story of like, hey, I want to consume a component that like somebody else has authored, which feels like a separate use case than like, how do I author something that I would want to publish to like a place for other people to use? So yeah, anyways, this is here. And if we've been thinking about like what things make sense to put here besides auto-generated docs for things that are published, like should there be instructions for how to grab these things, how to compose them with other things, and so on and so forth. And what stuff like doesn't belong here and should be in the component model book instead. So those are things that we've been thinking about a bit lately. But anyways, yep, that's that. This is probably also going to be like, yeah, released on a different URL soon and like erased, but then when we like put it in the next place, it should like reliably be there. And we're hoping that that'll happen, very like in the next few days. We'll have like hey, you can actually trust that this stuff won't get deleted by us for development purposes. So yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question, Danny. So, kind of what's I don't know, the community model, the license and publicly available model around this as it grows as a valuable resource?
Yeah, so there's a few things there. I guess also I was only kind of searching for like WASI stuff here. But like so here I like have you will see like there's these namespaces here. So packages can start with like something else as well. So like although the other thing too is that we've been like talking about having like private and public packages and like namespaces. So like WASI, there would probably be like, people who, or if people were interested in this, then there could be specific individuals who are the only people who have the ability to publish things like under the WASI namespace. And then the other thing too is that you can encode metadata, or you can put metadata into the binaries that you're publishing, which can include licensing information, which can also be rendered. So
okay. Maybe this is a good topic for us to have separately, not to go into here, but just want to
sure.
understand kind of the intersection between how we would affiliate with this work from a Bytecode Alliance perspective, or what we would tell people about the open source community, whatever sort of the structure that exists around it for us to be fully involved. So
Yeah.
let's have a separate conversation about that. I think it's good to have resources like this. We want to make them a part of the larger context if we can. So
definitely, yeah. So yeah, definitely happy to talk about things, more afterwards or here or
sure.
yeah.
On SIG documentation in Zulu.
Yeah, that sounds great too. So but anyways, yeah, I figured I'd show this just because it might like help with a conversation about which docs belong where, because yeah, this is definitely like kind of more of the user story, I guess, like I was saying, of docs for things that you would want to consume, which is very different for like docs on how to create.
Yeah, I think the larger question of where docs go and how can we make it easy for people to put docs someplace and then find them is a good one for us to tackle. Bailey had asked earlier, she likes to make pictures. We're going to have artwork. We're going to have, graphics and other things. So the wide variety of assets that we want to be able to facilitate sharing and access to and that sort of thing. So there's probably a good conversation to be had about, what's the library or library mechanism that we would use.
I guess I can stop sharing now unless anybody like wants me to like go through any more of it, but no.
Danny, I think this does what y'all have worked on with WA. It does is a very good picture of what people have been asking for. It's that how can I go see this interface and see the docs associated with it? And then I think what we need to, like what Dave was saying, we need to have a bigger conversation on is how that project relates to this SIG and to what level it does. But it is it's very exciting to see that work. And I just noticed, I feel like the past times you showed me, I didn't realize it was a public URL. So I'm excited to see that too. And so I might be referencing that already now. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think that fills in a gap for some people. And I think is, if anything, a point where we can talk about this fills these needs, or we need even more on top of this. And that has a good conversation of how we're already building out documentation.
Yeah, and I think for bonus points, this is also going to be an opportunity for us to build best practices for other SIGs, for example, right? There's a separate thread on Zulip about forming SIG embedded. They're going to have 11,000 questions in this space and very similar sort of abstract use cases and end user needs. And, if we can help guide them so that they don't get started, so that they do get started in a good way and anticipate this work that's going to be coming out here, I think that'll be helpful. They're going to benefit from whatever guidance we can give them.
Yeah, I think we've been hesitant to like talk about like the URL is like super like publicly available because we know that we're going to be like deleting things on it because it's like still in development. But we should be changing that relatively soon. And then like also we're basically wrapping up like permissioning these things, which I think is also going to be like crucial. So that way, yeah, we don't have like anybody publishing random stuff like under WASI or what have you. So, but yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that, Danny.
Yep.
So we have like 23 minutes left. I think at the 10-minute left mark, we can do our vote. But just to kind of go through some of the other things that we've talked about in the past, I think we might have covered most of it. But I can't remember who was making the point. It might have been Merlin. Like we need more language guides within our component model book. So there's already some immediate actions that people can take. And then I think a big one that we haven't addressed yet in this meeting is, where do people ask their component model questions? I think that's something that we should be thinking about, of like, say you're at a conference and someone says, oh, I have a question. Where do we go? Where do we send them? And I think when we talked about this at Plumber Summit, we arrived at Zulip. That is, I think right now it is a lot of maintainers that are there, but I think it does seem to be the place that we're hoping to expand out. So to be not just a place for maintainers, but also for users of the space. And so sending people to Zulip. And if that is the decision, we need to start linking Zulip to everything of documentation we have. That needs to be if you have more questions, go here. So that was another topic that we talked about, and maybe a goal we could have. And then there's a whole category of SEO, which Tim McCallum put a little effort into on our component book. But how do we make this documentation findable in that sense? And then one thing that we also talked about at Plumber Summit was, we have WIT in more of a human readable format in the component book. Let's point to that instead of the specification in our projects. And that can be a way to get people to the component book. So that was another like sub goal that we could potentially have. But yeah, those were basically the main categories that we've talked about in the past. Are there other areas that people think that we should be focusing in on? And then we could also transition the discussion from there to what should be our immediate goals. Okay, great. So we have a bunch of things we want to work on, and what's not captured in this list is what Merlin mentioned about more WASI docs and what Bailey mentioned about more user journeys in our examples. So this list just grew today, which is, and landing page, that was another request that you mentioned, Merlin. So these are all, we obviously have a lot to tackle. So I think one question I would have is, what do people want to focus on in the near term? How do we want to do process? What does project management look like for us? And what are priorities given the WASM.io and KubeCons coming up?
Bootstrapping some sort of landing page that helps to get the most fundamental versions of user stories to the right resources that are already out there seems useful in advance of KubeCon and WASM.io.
And the landing page would be a landing page for WASI and for the component model. It would just kind of be a, here are the resources in this ecosystem.
That's what I was hearing. Yeah.
Maybe that brings out a good point. Maybe we can kind of have a champion for that goal. Does anyone in particular want to kind of lead that discussion, and then we can continue that discussion in Zulip and on where that should be, what that should be?
I'm happy to.
Awesome. Our landing page champion, Eric. Another thing that was mentioned that was the WASI book. Merlin, do you feel like there is a timeline or a priority you have on wanting to create centralized documentation on like describing what WASI is and um, figuring out the overlap between that and the component book? Like, for example, you mentioned how do you use WIT to build host components? To me, that also fits in the component book and could potentially be an extension there. Like, to me, you defined a gap in the component model book. That is, we haven't talked about host components enough. So maybe we add that as an issue to the component book and try to flesh that out more for users.
So then I think it's a bit unclear to me what the difference then, or what would not be allowed to be in the component book. Are we then talking about simply runtimes that have support for some WASI functionality, but not support for the component model, or?
Yeah, I think the WASI book is a hard one to scope. I kind of see WASI as quite small in scope in the sense of what is WASI, like what are these previews, like what is the difference between preview 1 and preview 2, what are these interfaces that are in preview 2, what is the timeline to like expected to come in preview 3. To me, WASI is explaining what is the WebAssembly interfaces or WebAssembly systems interfaces, or if you want to do the different naming of it, WebAssembly standard interfaces that are part of each of these previews, and how do I see them and use them And then for the using them, it might point out to the component model book, assuming you're using the component model. But that does bring up the conversation of how much should we be documenting the module story? And in the past, I've heard that shouldn't be our area of focus, but I know you said you're working on embedded scenarios, Merlin, and I don't know if you're using WAMR, which doesn't use the component model yet.
Yeah, that's the main thing that I was thinking about. I have a student now who built everything with components, and now they also want to have an implementation in WAMR. And there's basically very little to point him to, like, oh, this is how you build, how you even build a module that uses WASI. And so I think that the way that things are going right now, I think we will have a very long period and maybe an indefinite period where multiple runtimes do not support the component model, but will support extensive functionality of WebAssembly system interface. And so that was specifically what I was referring to with the WASI documentation, not necessarily so much about the standards and processes and things like that, but more also technical focused, user focused. How do you build modules using system interface, everything that we have for the component model, but then what if the runtime doesn't have the component model? My idea was to just make the component model book into a WebAssembly system interfaces book, and then some of those interfaces could use the component model. I wonder if so talking about scoping, I wonder if maybe the wasi.dev site that we have right now, if we had an easy way to extend that website, to add pages to it, that all the information about the standardization process itself, about the future, about yeah, all that stuff, that we could just add it to that website. If there was an easy way for us to change that website, and then maybe have separate documentation, a separate documentation website specifically for using WebAssembly system interface without the component model.
I personally think that is a nice separation, wazi.dev being the place where you learn what this is and what is the process and where is this going, and then potentially a separate book that talks about how do I use, well, then we have two different things. One's how do I use like a modules, like how do I use modules with WASI? And then the other is how do I use each of these interfaces? Because we've also talked about like talking through scenarios for each interface and that potentially being a WASI book. For wazi.dev, this is the project. So I would say the first thing here would be like putting up a GitHub issue to say, hey, can we add this information here? Because that can only get a yes or a no and already would get us farther. And laying out what information that would potentially be. I'll put this in chat.
Wouldn't it be valuable to get the component model book linked on wazi.dev as well?
That sounds like another issue. Merlin, would you be interested in opening the first issue on can we get this WASI information? And then Thurston, do you want to add one on can we add a link here, please? Awesome. So we're coming up at our 10-minute left mark. Before we do our vote, I just want to create an understanding on what cadence we want to meet at. Do people feel the need to meet more regularly to start, like every week? And then we will move into maybe a slower cadence
Also, if you're setting up a cadence and you're considering it being weekly or bi-weekly, will WASM.io/KubeCon, I don't know how many of the attendees are planning on being at those and if that will disrupt people attending, but I know that I'll be at both of those. So yeah.
Those are very good points. So it sounds like regardless, it might be good to meet next week then, because that's before we lose those 2 weeks potentially for a lot of people. I'll be around those 2 weeks. So I'm happy to participate in conversations the other weeks while other people are at WASM IO and WASMCon. I mean, KubeCon. But that's a good point. We should expect some very decent drop off those weeks. So I guess Bailey updated the calendar invite to support weekly. So let's go ahead and say like next week. And if you're able to come and we can have more conversations on kind of, it seems like this unfolded into a lot of action items that we discussed separately. Um, I'm going to take an action item on myself to kind of try to over the next week improve the component book. So like walk through examples and get them working again. Um, and if other people want to also look there and see what could be improved and kind of putting up issues, that could be helpful as well. And then for the WASI book, Merlin, if your student who's been working on the module story has come across like good examples, or I don't know, thinking about that might be a good goal as well of what could go there. Any other topics or things people want to bring up before we vote and call a close to this? Anything that you want to call out that we should focus on next meeting?
One thing that somebody said was, yeah, does the component model book, I don't think has examples where you like actually import a WASI interface from your host and like leverage it. But yeah, that might be a good way to like kind of parse out how this information should be separated, because like at least then you're still like, okay, well, this is how you author a component. This isn't like a deep dive on like what WASI is, but this is how you like actually use it when you're authoring a component. Might be a good way to figure out what parts belong in the component model book versus not. So that could be a good thing to think about between now and next week. But yeah.
Are you saying making a way for the host to implement a basically a library for the guest to use? Because here I am using component terminology again.
I think I'm more just like if I wanted to like author, like I think we've got examples for like authoring a component in Rust, but what if we want that component to use the file system, and to take advantage of whatever implementation the host is providing for doing that kind of thing. I think that might be helpful for people.
Cool. Yeah, I think that is probably an immediate need for the documentation too. So maybe we can place that in the component model book somewhere, try to find a fit, and then we'll figure out if that lives elsewhere later.
I think there's a lot of value in talking about WASI Vert a lot more. It's come up a lot, especially in because I'm also on the CNCF's WASM working group calls, and we're, I'm actually planning on presenting to that group after KubeCon more about WASI Vert because it's really relevant for deployment and trying to solidify a lot of concepts for people too. So it'd be great to have a lot more documentation and use cases of that. Like for instance, if you have an example for the file system in that component model book using WASI Vert to virtualize the file system with another component that like really ties into something that's really kind of concrete.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've wondered about that as well. I do know that we are I think it's Dan is thinking about basically rewriting WASIVert. So there might be big changes, but I mean we should document what's out there now. So sounds like we have a couple issues to put up on the component model book on those two. Okay, it is time. Okay, so Danny, okay, actually we don't need a vote, I'm realizing. Anyone else want to nominate for co-chair and make it exciting to use this poll? Unless I might have missed it. Someone else might have already self-nominated in the chat. All right, last call. Let me check Zulip to make sure no one put anything in there too. Okay, I don't think anyone did. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Have there been any other nominations besides Danny and I? Okay, all right. Hello, welcome to your new co-chairs, Danny and I. Thank you everyone for voting. Awesome. Danny, we can sync on what process is next, but we'll sync with David and Bailey, but I'm pretty sure we'll need some permissions elevated, and then we can kind of discuss what we see that role is for us too.
Yeah, not surprisingly, we have created a document to use as a getting started guide for doing exactly what we're going to be doing or are doing here. And so I'll spin up a Zulip thread with Kate, Danny, me, Bailey, and we can walk through the process of the next steps, both to do them, but then also to help us make that document better. And then we'll be up and running. So look for that from me, and we can work through that together.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Okay, with that being said, I think we can end a few minutes early. Eric, do you mind putting up a PR with all of the wonderful notes that you've taken?
Absolutely. That'll be up shortly.
Okay, great. And our next meeting will be then next Wednesday at this time. And think about how this time works for you, everyone, and see if we could potentially alternate time zone with cadence of meetings too. And any last comments anyone has?
You send out an invite for that meeting next week?
Yeah, I think we have the calendar invite, and I'll put it back in the chat because it's been updated to have next week. So I'll post the ICS for it at least. And then ideally we'll have an email we can forward. We haven't figured that out yet, but we'll figure that out and get that in a better format for people. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and I'll see you next week.